This tutorial is going to cover some tips for working with drums in FL Studio. Now this tutorial assumes that you have some experience working with FL Studio, but that you aren't as skilled when working with drum production. Some of the information we'll be covering is briefly discussed in some of my other tutorials, but I wanted to take some time to get a bit more in depth with this subject as it's one of FL Studio's greatest strengths and weaknesses. Now when I say that, what I mean is drums are a strength in FL Studio because it's very easy to lay down drums and quickly get moving with your project. But it's also a weakness because the ease with which you can lay down drums sometimes causes people to get complacent about their drum sound. So we're going to look at two methods for using drums. First one, we'll be using multiple samplers, and then the second one, we'll discuss a little bit about using the Fruity Pad Controller, the FPC. Now my goal in this tutorial is to get you to think a little bit more in depth about your drum sound and how it plays a role in your project. So to start with, we'll look at using multiple instances of the sampler to lay down drums. Now in my opinion, this is the most difficult way of doing things because it's harder to see what's in play. I think that the FPC is much easier to work with because it offers more control in a more compact way. Now when working with drums, keep this in mind, you're using samples. Sample is nothing more than the recording of a sound. So we're essentially working with laying out drum sounds in patterns. The catch is that a real drummer is going to have many minor variations to their sound. Each drum hit will differ, however, slightly from the last. But when using sample drums, the drum hit will be the same every time. So we'll need to play around with it a little bit in order to get it to sound more lively. The principles we'll be discussing here can be applied no matter what type of musical style you work with, although some of these tips will be better suited for certain styles than for others. Now I've already laid out some samples in the step sequencer. For this example, I wanted to get a digital electronica style sound. Now I'm going to go through and work with the drums a little bit just to give you the basics on how we can get a better drum sound. All too often, I hear people's FL Studio projects and they haven't really taken any time to go in and do anything to the drums. Your drum part is going to be what drives your song. It's the backbone of any project and needs the appropriate amount of attention. Again, FL Studio makes it very quick and easy to throw down some drums, but you can't let that keep you satisfied. Also, in this example, I've set the swing to about halfway to give us a more house kind of sound. So we've got this drum pattern, and now is where we need to take a step back and figure out what needs to be adjusted and why. I'm going to go ahead and play this example, and usually I'm using headphones when I do these tutorials, but for this I want to be able to mix things in a better environment, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off the mic. Let me go ahead and play this example for you first so that you can hear it and hear what the unaffected sound sounds like. So that's the unaffected sound. I just dropped the sample straight in. I haven't made any kind of adjustments yet. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of people leave their drums. They don't make any real adjustments to them because they figure the samples have already been EQ'd and everything. But we can definitely make some improvements to this sound. So I'm going to go through and play this example, and as I play it, I'm going to be making changes to it, and then once we get done, I'm going to go back over each change made and discuss the reason why it was made. Plus, I've already worked on this project and exported the untouched loop, what you just heard. So once we get done, we'll compare the original with what we end up with. Again, I'm going to go into the mixer and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the mic while I make these adjustments. So what I want to do now is go over what we just did and discuss in depth the principles behind it. First, panning. Panning is important for a number of reasons, especially with drums. Drums encompass a wide range of sound. A bass or guitar can give off different notes, can change pitch, etc., but they can only emit one single sound. A drum set works the entire frequency spectrum, from the kick drum at the low end through the snare in the middle, onto the hi-hat and cymbals at the top end. So it's important that we take advantage of this and pan our drums. Also, modern recording demands that we pan our drums to avoid stepping on other instruments, as well as to avoid stepping on other drums. Plus, normal human hearing inside our ears uses different functions to determine where the sound is coming from on a spatial plane. Therefore, we're used to hearing sounds coming from all around us, not just straight ahead in one place. So taking all that together, drums using a wide variety of sounds and frequencies, the need to avoid stepping on top of other instruments and drums in the same frequency space, plus the human ear perceiving sounds coming from a single source as unnatural. With all of that, we need to pan the drums. When it comes to panning drums, there are different schools of thought. Some producers like to hard pan things like the snare and hi-hat. Some producers like to emulate the space of a drum kit, panning the drums either to match the position in front of the drummer or a position as if it was from the drummer's point of view. I personally try not to follow any hard rules when it comes to panning, simply because it comes down to this. Each project is different and each project's needs are different. I can't tell you that panning a hi-hat to hard right is what you need on every single drum part. Chances are, if you try to do that, you'll end up with more bad mixes than good ones. For this example, since we just have drums, I pan the hi-hat to about 50% and the snare to about 20%. I like to keep the drums in front of the drummer point of view, but that's just my preference. I do, however, almost always keep the kick straight down the middle. If I pan it to maybe 2% right or left if I have a bass that's competing for sound, since the bass usually goes down the middle as well. And if I do this, I'll usually pan the bass 4% left or right, opposite the bass drum. And the reason for this is that bass frequencies, since they're comprised of waves that, because of their lower frequency and wavelength, actually end up wrapping around the listener's head, and that causes confusion in your brain as to where the source is coming from. So that's why bass frequencies are usually best left down the middle, while the higher frequencies are better left farther out. Now, aside from panning, I added a bit of delay to the kick drum and then some compression. The reason for the delay is to fatten up the kick. Because we're working with an electronica style, I opted for a longer delay and then just brought the wet down a little bit and chose the diffuse preset in the delay bank plugin because it offers what I'm looking for. But using delay on a kick or a bass is usually best with a very short delay time. This effect also offered us a bit of ambient texture to the kick as well. Next, I added compression. Compression is great for drums as long as you don't overdo it. The point is not to squash the drum sound, but to use compression to cause the head of the drum hit to pop. This is done through the waveform being compressed so that the waveform is more equal in volume across the entire sample. Of course, it's beyond the scope of this tutorial to really get into compression, but I added a little bit to the snare and kick drum and then to the entire mix to bring all the parts together and add a little bit of pop to the principal pieces. Now on the snare, I've added the Blood Overdrive plugin in order to give it a little bit more of a sizzling kind of sound. The snare before I felt was a little bit flat, but a little bit of distortion will add some bite. Now the EQ that I did was so that each part showcased its most prominent feature, most prominent frequencies. For the kick, it was the low end, the snare, the upper mid-range, and then the hi-hat, the higher frequencies. As with any EQ, it's always best to lower before you raise. This avoids any unwanted volume levels raising. So now that we've covered what was changed and why, what I want to do is go back through and take a listen to the original version, and then go back through and listen to the mixed version again so that you can hear the difference between what we started out with and what we ended up with just a little bit of processing. And again, I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic off so that it doesn't bleed through here. So you can see that those minor enhancements gave us a more thick drum sound with more space and life. Of course, with any mixing, the other instruments are going to determine the factors we discussed, and you should always trust your ears. Now, the next example I want to take a look at is using the FPC for drums. Now, I'm not going to go into as much detail as we've just covered a lot of information, but I wanted to point out some advantages to using the FPC. With samplers, you have to insert a separate sampler for each drum hit. If you choose to work in the piano roll instead of the step sequencer, you end up having to go back and forth between the different drum hits, and it's much more difficult to find your place in the beat. And of course, this takes up precious time when trying to get your ideas down on screen. The FPC, on the other hand, allows you to load all of your samples, up to 32 samples with multiple layers on each, using just one instance of the FPC. From there, you can use the piano roll to manipulate the velocity, pitch, timing, frequency, cutoff, resonance, all that on each hit. With the sampler, you can only change the sound of the entire sample unless you go into the piano roll on each, like we just discussed. Also, you can write out your entire drum part on one pattern rather than writing different parts and inserting them in the playlist. And this is good because it allows us to insert little fills every now and then to keep the drum sound interesting. And actually, that's one of the things that separates interesting drum lines from boring ones. If you pay attention, even a genre like trance, which relies on a straight 4 bass drum on almost every track, producers who know what they're doing throw in little snare fade-ins and fade-outs here and there, and it's much easier to do this kind of work in the FPC because all of the drum parts are right in front of you. And I know it's kind of silly for me to say, after all of this, I do want you to use what feels most comfortable for you. Don't change just because somebody else tells you that it's better. Work with what you feel comfortable with. Trust your ears, and you'll never have a problem. All the technical info in the world isn't going to give you a good mix unless you use your ears and feel comfortable in your studio environment. And just to demonstrate what I've done with the FPC, I just set up this example here. I loaded some samples into it. And just to show you how you can do all of your drums right here and then adjust the velocity and everything, I went ahead and set this up. So I'll go ahead and play this example and you can see what I've done. So in working with that, it just makes it a lot easier because I have all my drum parts right here. And if I need to go in and change anything, I can go in and change it right here instead of having to go back and switch through different samplers and zoom in. So it just makes it a lot easier for me. So I hope I was able to give you some information on working with drums in FL Studio, and I hope that some of these tips will help you to expand your drum sound and your projects. Please remember again that the drum line is what lives at the heart of your project, and if the drums are bad, the whole project will suffer no matter how good everything else is. But I want to thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.